The last time we had a block of two or more consecutive sets on the same plane was about 3 years ago, with every set since being a one-off set. Not only this, but there hasn't been a multi-set block in a brand new plane since Ixalan block concluded more than 8 years ago. These facts stand in stark contrast to earlier eras of Magic, which for decades had us venture to one plane a year over the course of 3 sets, often a brand new plane. To be clear, this change was intentional, its communication was public, and its reasons for happening were on some level understandable. Later sets and blocks sold worse than earlier ones, limited environments were tricky to make satisfying, and a set with lukewarm reception getting followed up with an immediate double and triple down to the same setting was certainly not an ideal outcome for developers or players, you might reasonably say. And yet, to lay my cards on the table here, I do not like the new status quo we find ourselves in. Having every set be a new plane, particularly with 5 or more sets per year, makes things feel rushed, makes it feel like there's no time to breathe and to become immersed in a particular world. And if I really wanted to let nostalgia take the wheel on this one, I could tell you that the gradual pivot from 3-set blocks to purely one-off sets has been an unambiguous tragedy, that we as Magic players are fallen and need to return to the glory days of 2013, where Magic sets came in threes and where bold duels could take place on a middle school lunch table. I'd love to be able to contribute yet another uncomplicated piece of ammunition to the siege on the decisions currently being made by Hasbro, but in truth, the issue of blocks is a bit more complicated than that. I do think there is something wrong with what we're currently doing, where standard legal sets take us to 6 or 7 different planes every single year, but 3-set blocks don't really represent a better vision of the game, just one with a different set of problems. So here I want to lay out my case for what has gone wrong, both past and present, and talk about an alternative approach to the way we conceptualize sets and their structuring. And I'll be getting into a very specific missed opportunity that occurred in 2024 that provides a fascinating case study. To start with, here's a very brief timeline of blocks as a concept. The first conventional 3-set block was Mirage Block in 1996, and this would set a trend of 3-set blocks beginning in October that would continue basically uninterrupted for the following 18 years until the release of Battle for Zendikar. There were also yearly or semi-yearly core sets over this span of time, but aside from that and some extras like Masters sets and unsets, the general idea was 1 block a year and 3 sets per block. Then in 2015, Magic the Gathering switched to 2-set blocks, and this pattern would continue until War of the Spark in 2019, which was either a standalone set or the 3rd set of the 3rd Ravnica block, depending on how you count. From there, sets were a mixture of one-offs like Kaldheim and 2-set blocks that returned to a pre-existing plane, such as Midnight Hunt, and the final 2-set Return to block ended about 3 years ago with the release of March of the Machine. Ever since, it's been all one-offs, with consecutive sets never featuring the same setting. And I guess I'll start my discussion of blocks by saying that the current era of blocks we're in does not feel very good, and on a level pretty fundamental to the way we experience the game. Obviously, there are other factors contributing to the way Magic feels in 2026, but the set structure being all one-offs isn't insignificant. The current progression of things offers no time to stop and breathe in a particular plane, no time to be interested about what it has to offer next, and no spare moments to stop and reflect. Storylines are bouncing and disconnected, since we can never stop and watch how a particular plane changes for any length of time, only get a fleeting snapshot of it before we're off to the next place. Thought and effort is put into how sets on different planes tie into one another mechanically for standard purposes, but we don't really get to see iterations on a mechanical theme like we did sometimes in the past. Everything a plane has to offer needs to be immediately present, since there's only one set worth of it. So as you can tell, I really don't think what we're doing in the present is ideal. However, that doesn't mean the way sets were structured in the past was necessarily better, and to explore that, we really need to talk about 3-set blocks. This was the way Magic sets were organized for years and years, and here I want to hone in on the 3 blocks I was fully around for: Return to Ravnica, Theros, and Khans of Tarkir. RTR was structured into the Namesake set that contained 5 of the guilds, Gatecrash, which contained the other 5, and Dragon's Maze, which featured all 10 guilds. That final set also focused on The Maze, which was a sort of structure built into the city and which would host a race in which a runner from each guild would travel to the maze's end, and this process would ultimately help decide the balance of power in Ravnica. This is all fine and cool, lore-wise, but it didn't really get conveyed that well in the Dragon's Maze set. The set was small and thus felt kind of cramped with 10 guilds, and the things explicitly mentioning parts of the lore, the gates, the gatekeepers, and Maze's End itself, were both few and honestly pretty bad. I didn't even know the legendary creatures of the set were supposed to be Maze Runners, because the set didn't really draw attention to this element of the story at all. Dragon's Maze simply didn't feel like a proper third set, rather just a little bit of extra Ravnica with some attached plot that not enough effort was put into guiding us through with its design. The following 2 blocks also each contained a set that didn't really fit in, but in the case of those, it was the middle set. Theros, the set, established the plane as a setting based around Greek myths, and also introduced characters such as Elspeth as a monster-slaying champion, and Xenagos as a satyr planeswalker who aspired to godhood. Born of the Gods was the second set of the block, and featured the story of Xenagos ascending to godhood amidst growing chaos within the Pantheon. Journey into Nyx was the third set, and focused on the consequences of Xenagos' godhood, and the ensuing showdown that resulted from it. That all sounds fine and good, but in terms of gameplay, the second set, Born of the Gods, was very strange, and a big reason why it stands out as odd is that the other 2 sets actually did a really great job conveying the progression of the block through their mechanics. Theros was more focused on the mortal plane, through its heavy usage of heroic and monstrosity as mechanics, whereas Journey into Nyx was much more focused around the pantheon of the gods and the conflict within it, which could be seen in its constellation mechanic and extra high density of enchantments. Born of the Gods, on the other hand, featured a couple kinda weird mechanics and didn't really convey a strong sense of place or time. It felt more like Theros B-sides than anything else, just some kinda odd designs to go along with a group of 5 gods, in order to allow the 15 gods to be evenly spread between the 3 sets. It played an undeniable role in tracing Xenagos' storyline, but in most other ways than that, the set was a bit of a disappointment. The same goes to a lesser extent for the Tarkir block. Khans of Tarkir focused on the 5 warring factions in a world where dragons have gone extinct, and Dragons of Tarkir features an alternate timeline where dragons are still around, and where Tarkir's clans and characters have altered fates. The middle set, Fate Reforged, was a little odd though. Lore-wise, it involves Sarkhan traveling back in time to when dragons were still around alongside the 5 clans, and intervening in the battle between Ugin and Nicol Bolas. This is cool as a way to transition between Khans and dragons, but in terms of gameplay, it just sort of felt like an awkward mashup of the 2 sets. Fate Reforged used 3 clan keywords from Khans and 2 of the changed ones from DTK, it had some dragons rather than none or a whole bunch, and the clans were less 3-color focused than Khans, but not quite the 2-color pairings from dragons. For a middle set separated from the other 2 by 1300 years, this feels more like the middle of an Animorphs cover than it does its own cohesive world. To be clear, it is still easily the most defensible third set of the 3 blocks I've mentioned, and to be honest, I can imagine this feeling like a genuinely compelling 3-set block with a handful of changes to this middle set. Nonetheless, in the form it ended up in, Fate Reforged feels like a continuation of a trend, one of the sets in a block being a little awkward, and feeling more like a stepping stone for story purposes than a fully thought out landscape of its own. So, these are the 2 extremes. On the one hand, you've got the current status quo where every set is a new plane and no setting ever has time to breathe or experience change. And then you have the status quo of years past, where 3-set blocks are the norm and usually feature an awkward second or third set, mostly there for storytelling purposes. Naturally, I would prefer that we find our way back to a nice in-between, though I will say that I don't think that in-between would be an endless series of 2-set blocks like we had in the mid to late 2010s. One-off sets can be great as a way to do something funky and unusual, to explore some bold new aesthetic territory without committing too hard, and to have a set where following a story isn't necessarily a main priority. Edge of Eternities was a great one-off set to shake the game up with some out-there aesthetics and new mechanics, and I imagine Wizards of the Coast is enjoying the opportunity to gauge community feedback on something like that. The same goes for Duskmourn. I could have taken 2 sets of that, but for the player base at large, it makes sense as an interesting experiment into an unusual setting with a more modern aesthetic, and a way to introduce a cool new subtype like Rooms that plays into that setting. Even Outlaws at Thunder Junction would have felt a lot better if it was surrounded by a couple 2-set blocks. It's okay to have a set that's a little silly, a little gimmicky, a little odd story-wise. It's okay to have a hat set. However, in order for that sort of set to feel justified, it kind of has to feel differentiated in some way from what surrounds it. It has to have a degree of adjacency to a non-hat set for the sake of contrast, right? It might not be clear exactly what I mean here, so now is as good a time as any to talk about the specific appeals I find in 2-set blocks, and why I think they should once again become a staple part of the way sets are structured, alongside one-off sets. The biggest reason I like 2-set blocks is that they're able to tell the story of a place much better than a 1-set block could. Let's jump back to the 3-set blocks set on brand new planes that I mentioned earlier, Theros and Tarkir. Setting aside the awkward second set in each of these, we can notice a pattern here. Set 1 establishes a setting, and then a later set complicates that setting, introducing new elements and showcasing a dramatically changed version of it. This is a wonderfully blunt form of storytelling, and seeing that clear change communicated through the design of a set would be great for getting players to engage more with the lore and ask more questions, as opposed to one-off sets that present a snapshot of things and then dash away at full speed. Two set blocks with a dramatic change between set 1 and set 2 can also draw out the lifespan of a given setting without letting things feel stagnant, and without causing the negative impacts to limited that have been caused by a lot of blocks in the past. If both sets of a given block are full-sized and contain their own important features and distinguishing characteristics, you'll be getting the benefits of being able to tell a story and letting players stay engaged for longer, but you'll also get the benefits of being able to present each set as something cool and different, and you can even make each playable as its own standalone limited format, if that's a concern. Now, all of this still might seem a little abstract, so how about we talk about some specific examples, a few sets since 2023 that might have been nice as two-set blocks, and which to me kind of represent missed opportunities we should be studying. Murders at Karlov Manor stands out as an interesting case study because it's a set where they were clearly going for a version of the established then change framework I mentioned earlier. Ravnica Remastered came out in January of 2024, followed by MKM a month later, and you can kind of see the vision here. Remind people what Ravnica is, and then do something cool and different with the Ravnica setting. I actually think this framework could have worked here without that many changes to MKM itself. Instead of Ravnica Remastered a month in advance, drop an original new Ravnica set 2 months in advance. In that set, you'd want to establish the characters and setting that would be relevant for the following set, and importantly, you'd want to feature the guilds. They could maybe be a bit less present than previous Ravnica sets, but they definitely need to be there in the first place, and they need to have some sort of tie-in with the story of Murders at Karlov Manor, because why else are we returning to Ravnica again? There's no shortage of planes you could set a murder mystery in, and choosing Ravnica, the plane about guilds, with only a feeble little, oh yeah, this plane exists, reprint set a month before, is just a very odd choice. So this is one example of a return to set that needed an accompanying set to work well. And I also think Lorwyn Eclipsed would have been another great candidate to be a two-set block. It's an iconic and beloved plane, and the original Lorwyn superblock was broken up into two separate two-set blocks, one for Lorwyn and one for its darker counterpart, Shadowmoor. The Lorwyn Eclipsed set we got was far from bad, but it did feel a bit rushed as a one-set return to a setting that was originally built out with 4 sets, and I have to imagine a 2-set Lorwyn plus Shadowmoor pairing would have made for an appealing choice. So there are clear instances where I think we could have benefited from a 2-set block when returning to an iconic plane. However, to me, the biggest missed opportunity of the past 3 years was actually a new set, Bloomburrow. I truly cannot think of a more obvious slam dunk of a 2-set block than Bloomburrow. Any competent market research would have suggested that this was going to be a very popular and well-received set, and the final product indicates that Wizards of the Coast was willing to put in the necessary effort to make it great. Not only this, but it self-justifies being a 2-set block in beautifully simple fashion, and we can see an indication of this in the full art lands. Imagine this, the first set of the block is set in late spring, and this is where we're introduced to this vibrant world and all its creature types. Then, the second set of the block takes place in autumn, and there's decidedly more urgency and darkness as the various creatures prepare for winter, in some sense. What exactly that looks like, or how literal versus metaphorical the preparing for winter element is, could depend on a lot of things, but regardless, it seems like a very natural 2-part progression. Create a setting, and then complicate it. So if we were still in an era where 2-set blocks are an accepted part of life, this all lines up perfectly. A plane that feels cohesive with the MTG universe, an aesthetic that is almost guaranteed to be widely appealing, and a setting that very naturally features change over time that can be played with in interesting ways. But we're not in that sort of era. We haven't been in an era where a new plane could get its own block in more than 8 years. So, it didn't happen. I vividly remember the excitement of following the sets in a block when I was in my first few years of playing the game. These were localized, tangible stories about what was happening in a particular plane, rather than just being one puzzle piece in a grand meta-narrative about the Omen Paths or something. Anecdotally, when I talk to people who started playing Magic more recently and ask what sets they were especially engaged with as they were getting into the game, a frequent answer is the 4-set Phyrexia arc that concluded in 2023. That fondness may or may not represent a wide swath of the player base, but it's not hard to imagine why people might be excited about something like that. It's a story as central to the broader Magic lore as it gets, told over the span of 4 sets with time for anticipation to build as the Phyrexian threat ramped up. If Bloomburrow had been a 2-set block, I have to imagine we would have had something similar, possibly to an even greater extent. Large swaths of players fondly recounting their introduction into the game being a months-long period where Magic the Gathering found itself centered in a lushly realized landscape straight out of Redwall. In a blog post last year, Burke Rosewater laid out his mindset on blocks in general and Bloomburrow in specific, and it's really interesting as a documentation of how a major decision maker conceptualizes money, people, and how the two intersect. It starts with the objective metric that sales are almost always lower for subsequent sets in a block, and then uses this data point to make a couple strange extrapolations from there, that players don't want to stay in the same world for consecutive sets, and that players respond better given a gap between visits to a given plane. The issue is, those aren't things that sales data can tell you. There are a ton of reasons why subsequent sets in a block might sell worse, and imagining that a hypothetical second Bloomburrow set hypothetically selling worse than the first would have equated to players sitting around being kinda glum about returning to the plane too soon? Well, it's a very odd way to conceptualize people and what their financial decisions mean. And just to reiterate, I do like one-off sets, and I genuinely understand the benefits that Wizards of the Coast sees in them. They allow for greater flexibility, they allow for a higher density of different settings, and apparently they sell a bit better too, which is a genuinely understandable consideration. However, there can be other considerations, because doesn't the all one-offs status quo have a cost too? I mentioned earlier that I don't mind having a hat set here or there. It's fine to take a fun little break from longer, more serious story arcs. But that becomes a harder sell when every set is a hat set, or at least when every set receives the same treatment as a hat set. When every set is a one-off, when OTJ is treated the same as Bloomburrow, which is treated the same as Spider-Man, which is treated the same as Lorwyn, it feels a little wrong. It feels like the people making the game have no faith in the worlds they're creating, even when they clearly have the ability to create something great. And, at least for me, this disjointed mishmash of one-off sets makes me less interested in the game, and the clear lack of creative conviction that this process exudes makes me less interested in what Wizards of the Coast has to offer as a company that, on some level, produces art. I wish we could see them being a bit more daring, taking more risks with what they're putting out in pursuit of creating an excellent game. You could argue that releasing a never-ending string of funky one-off sets is a version of being bold and taking risks, but to me that's the easier road. The harder version of being bold is actually committing to a vision, sincerely believing in and caring about a product enough to see it to a satisfying conclusion, and trusting in your own ability to tell a multiple-part story that people care about. And I don't know. In 2026, I think we could use a little more of that. Thanks for watching, and wow, this video ended up going a little deeper than I intended. Why don't I make a fun little video about blocks, I said to myself in early March. Let me know what you think of what I'm saying here. This is definitely a bit outside the realm of what I normally produce. Anyway, thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. I've been exploring some options for new Bracket 4 decks lately, and Architect's maybe board categories have been great for keeping all my thoughts organized. A link to my decks is down in the description. Also, I'm going to be at MagicCon Vegas in just a little bit, and I'll be running a live podcast episode on Friday alongside Trinket Mage and a couple friends of the pod. Come on by if that sounds up your alley. If you want to support what I do here, you can grab some high-quality sleeves from Dragon Shield, affiliate link in the description, or you can support me more directly through Patreon or a YouTube membership. These folks, some of whom are on screen now, help with the rent money, coffee, and copies of Nexus of Becoming that keep this channel chugging along, and you can join them today. Think about how accomplished you'll feel afterward.